The average private rent in England has reached £1,446 a month, £47 more than a year ago. And Angela Rayner has just ruled out rent controls. So what exactly is stopping your landlord from putting your rent up? Here is the part most of the coverage skips. Ruling out rent controls is a political choice, not a change in the law. And the law that already exists puts real limits on how and how often your rent can go up. So let us separate what was announced from what is actually in force. Start with what was said, because it is narrower than the headlines suggest. Speaking to BBC Breakfast, Angela Rayner said the government would not be looking at rent controls at the moment. Her argument was that the protections already brought in through the Renters' Rights Act are a better way to stabilise the market, and that Scotland's experience had not necessarily brought rents down. Now, that is a policy position. It is the government choosing not to introduce a new cap. It is not a new statute, and it does not remove anything renters already have. So when you hear no rent controls, read it as no fixed cap on the amount, not no rules at all. So what is it that is not happening? A rent control, in the strict sense, sets a ceiling on what can be charged. A rent freeze goes further and stops increases altogether for a period. Some versions also limit the rent between one tenant and the next, so a landlord cannot reset it to a higher figure when someone new moves in. These are blunt tools, and reasonable people disagree about them. Supporters say they hold rents down for people already struggling. Critics say they can shrink the number of homes available to rent because some landlords sell up or stop letting. The government has chosen not to introduce those controls. Instead, it is relying on market rent limits, formal notice requirements, and the tribunal challenge process. What it leaves in place is a different system, and that system is the part that actually protects you. Here is what is in force, as enacted law, not policy. Since the 1st of May 2026, the Renters' Rights Act changed how a private landlord can raise the rent in England. There is now only one lawful route, a formal notice, known as a Section 13 notice. Rent review clauses, the kind buried in a contract that let rent climb automatically, no longer have effect on these tenancies. Using that notice, a landlord can increase the rent only once in any 12-month period. The first increase cannot take effect until at least 52 weeks after the tenancy began, and they must give you at least 2 months' notice before the new rent starts. So a landlord cannot raise your rent on a whim, cannot do it twice in a year, and cannot do it through a clause you signed months ago. That is not a cap on the number, but it is a real limit on the how and the how often. Now, the obvious worry. If there is no cap on the amount, can they just name a huge figure and dare you to leave? Not quite. The law says a rent increase under this route cannot be pushed above the market rent. That is, roughly what the property would fetch if it were advertised to let today. And if you think the figure you have been given is above the market rate, you can challenge it at the first-tier tribunal, which decides what the market rent actually is. Two things make that challenge safer than it used to be. Under the new rules, the tribunal cannot set your rent higher than the amount the landlord asked for, so challenging cannot backfire into a bigger rise. And the increase applies from the tribunal's decision, not backdated to the original date. In cases of real hardship, the tribunal can also push the start of the increase back by up to a further 2 months. So the ceiling is not a fixed percentage. The ceiling is the market, and you have a route to test whether they have stayed under it. A word on Scotland, because it came up, and because it is easy to get wrong. Rayner's point was narrow. She said Scotland's experience had not necessarily brought rents down. That is her claim, and it is a contested one. not a settled fact. The fuller picture is more complicated. Scotland's earlier measures were temporary and applied differently to sitting tenants and to new lets. And Scotland has since moved to a newer system under the Housing Scotland Act 2025, allowing designated rent control areas where increases can be capped at inflation plus 1%, up to a maximum of 6%. That framework is different from the emergency measures being referred to, and it is a separate legal system from England. So take Scotland as a live debate, not as proof that controls simply failed. So what do you actually do when a rent increase lands on your mat? First, check how it was served. For a covered tenancy in England, an increase should come through that formal Section 13 notice, giving at least 2 months. Check the date when the new rent is meant to take effect. Would it begin less than 52 weeks after your tenancy started, or less than 52 weeks after the last increase took effect? If so, the notice may be too early. Then ask the real question: is the new figure actually above the market rent for a place like yours? Look at what similar local properties are being advertised for and keep the evidence. If it looks above market, you can apply to the first-tier tribunal before the new rent is due to start. And remember, they cannot raise it above what the landlord asked. I am not going to tell you to simply refuse to pay, because that can put your home at risk. Get advice first from Shelter, Citizens Advice, or a housing solicitor, and act inside the deadlines written on the notice. So, Angela Rayner has ruled out rent controls, but that is a policy choice, not a change in the law, and it does not leave landlords free to charge anything they like. Your rent can still only be raised once a year through a formal notice with 2 months' warning and no higher than the market rate. And you can challenge a figure you think is too high. Has your landlord tried to raise your rent this year? Tell me how much and whether it felt fair in the comments. This is general information, not legal advice. This has been Housing Crisis Guide UK.